25. The formation of Prussia. It was characteristic of the 17th century that very small states were able to play an influential part in European affairs, seemingly out of all proportion to their size. The main reason why small states could act as great powers was that armies were small and weapons were simple. Difficulties of supply and communications, the poor condition of the roads, the lack of maps, the absence of general staffs, together with many other administrative and technical difficulties, reduced the number of soldiers who could be successfully managed in a campaign. The battles of the 30 Years' War, on the average, were fought by armies of less than 20,000 men. And while Louis XIV, by the last years of his reign, built up a military establishment aggregating some 400,000, the actual field armies in the wars of Louis XIV did not exceed, on the average, 40,000. Armies of this size were well within the reach of smaller powers. If especially well trained, disciplined, and equipped, and if ably commanded, the armies of smaller states could defeat those of 216 much larger neighbors. On this fact, fundamentally, the German state of Prussia would be built. But Sweden was actually the first such smaller power to exploit this kind of military opportunity with spectacular consequences. Sweden's short-lived empire, 413. Sweden almost, but not quite, formed an empire in Central and Eastern Europe in the 17th century. The population of Sweden at the time was not over 1 million. It was smaller than that of the Dutch Republic. But the Swedes produced a line of extraordinary rulers, ranging from genius in Gustavus Adolphus, 1611 to 1632, through the brilliantly unconventional Queen Christina, 1632 to 1654, to the amazing military exploits of Charles XII, 1697 to 1718. The elective Swedish kingship was made hereditary, so that the royal power was freed from control by the estates. Craftsmen and experts were brought from Western countries, notably Holland. War industries were subsidized by the government, and an army was created with many novel features in weapons, organization, and tactics. With this army, Gustavus Adolphus crossed the Baltic in the 30 Years' War, made alliances with Protestant German princes, cut through the Holy Roman Empire, and helped to ward off the Habsburg unification of Germany. The Swedish crown, by the Peace of Westphalia, received certain coastal regions of Germany. Subsequently, in a complex series of wars, the Swedes won control of virtually all the shores and cities of the Baltic. Only Denmark, at the mouth of that sea, and the territories of the sea, House of Brandenburg, which had almost no ports, remained independent. For a time, the Baltic was a Swedish lake. The Russians were shut off from it, and the Poles and even the Germans, who lived on its shores, could use the Baltic only on Swedish terms. Swedish territorial victories. The final Swedish campaign for imperial expansion took place during the meteoric reign of Charles VII. As a young man, he found his dominions attacked by Denmark, Poland, and Russia. He won remarkable victories over them, but would not make peace. He then led an army back and forth across the Eastern European plain, only to be crushed by the Russians. He fled to the Ottoman Empire and spent several years as a guest and protege of the Turks, before he eventually returned to Sweden. By the time Charles died in 1718, the Swedish sphere had contracted to 414 Sweden itself, except that Finland and reduced holdings in northern Germany remained Swedish for a century more. The Swedes in time proved themselves exceptional among European peoples in not harping on their former greatness. They successfully and peaceably made the transition from the role of an important military state to that of a small power. Charles VII. The territorial growth of Brandenburg Prussia. In the long run, it was to be Prussia that dominated the northern part of Central Europe. Prussia became famous for its militarism, which may be said to exist when military needs and military values permeate all other spheres of life. Through its influence on Germany over a period of 2 centuries, Prussia played a momentous part in modern European and world history. The south coast of the Baltic, where Prussia was to arise, was an unpromising site for the creation of a strong political power. It was an uninviting country, thinly populated, with poor soil and without mineral resources, more backward than Saxony or Bohemia, not to mention the busy centers of South Germany and Western 217 Europe. It was a flat, open plain, merging imperceptibly into Poland without prominent physical features or natural frontiers. See maps pp. 425, 206, 220 to 221. The coastal region directly south from Sweden was known as Pomerania. Inland from it, shut off from the sea, was Brandenburg, centering about Berlin. Brandenburg had been founded in the Middle Ages as a border state, a mark or march of the Holy Roman Empire, to fight the battles of the empire against the then heathen Slavs. Its ruler, the Margrave, was one of the 7 princes who, after 1356, elected the Holy Roman Emperor. Hence, he was commonly called the Elector of Brandenburg. After 1415, the electors were always of the Hohenzollern family. 415, all Germany east of the Elbe, including Brandenburg, represented a medieval conquest by German-speaking peoples. The German Drang nach Osten, or drive to the east. From the Elbe to Poland, German conquerors and settlers had replaced the Slavs, eliminating them or absorbing them by intermarriage. Eastward from Brandenburg and outside the Holy Roman Empire stretched a region inhabited by Slavic peoples. Next to the east came Prussia, which eventually was to give its name to all territories of the Hohenzollern monarchy. This original Prussia formed part of the lands of the Teutonic Knights, a military crusading order that had conquered and Christianized the native peoples in the 13th century. Except for its seacoast along the Baltic, the Duchy of Prussia was totally enclosed by the Polish kingdom. To the north, along the Baltic, as far as the Gulf of Finland, German minorities lived among Lithuanians, Latvians, or Lets, and Estonians. The towns were German, founded as German commercial colonies in the Middle Ages, and many of the landlords were German also, descendants of the Teutonic Knights, and later known as the Baltic Barons. Germans expand eastward. Modern Prussia began to emerge in the 17th century when a number of territories came into the hands of the Hohenzollerns of Brandenburg. In 1618, the Elector of Brandenburg inherited the Duchy of Prussia. Another important development occurred when the old ruling line in Pomerania expired during the 30 Years' War. Although the Swedes succeeded in taking the better part of Pomerania, the Elector of Brandenburg received at the Peace of Westphalia eastern Pomerania. Barren, rural, and harborless though it was, it at least had the advantage of connecting Brandenburg with the Baltic. The Hohenzollerns no sooner obtained it than they began to dream of joining it with their Duchy of Prussia to the east, a task that required the absorption of an intermediate and predominantly Slavic area, which was part of Poland, a task not accomplished until 1772. 416 territorial acquisitions of the Hohenzollerns. Had the Duchy of Prussia and Eastern Pomerania been the only acquisitions of the Hohenzollerns, their state would have been oriented almost exclusively toward Eastern Europe. But at the Peace of Westphalia, they received, in addition to Eastern Pomerania, new territories on the west bank of the Elbe. Moreover, through the play of family inheritances common in the Holy Roman Empire, the Hohenzollerns had earlier, in 1614, come to control the small state of Cleves on the Rhine at the Dutch border, and a few other small territories also in western Germany. These were separated from the main Hohenzollern lands around Brandenburg by many intermediate German principalities. But the western territories provided direct contact with the more advanced regions of Western Europe, and a base from which larger holdings in the Rhineland were eventually to be built up. In the 17th century, the dominions of the House of Brandenburg were therefore developing in 3 disconnected territories. The main one was Brandenburg, with 218 adjoining Pomerania and territories along the Elbe. There was also a detached eastern territory in the Duchy of Prussia and another small detached western territory on and near the Rhine. To connect and unify these 3 territorial possessions became the long-range policy of the Brandenburg House. 417 Frederick William, who became known as the Great Elector, governed Prussia for almost 50 years, 1640 to 1688, and set his country on a course toward new power and military influence in Central Europe. Photo Marburg, Art Resource, NY. In the midst of the 30 Years' War in 1640, a young man of 20, named Frederick William, succeeded to these diverse possessions. Known later as the Great Elector, he was the first of the several influential leaders who shaped modern Prussia. He had grown up under trying conditions. Brandenburg was one of the parts of Germany to suffer most heavily from the war. Its location made it the stamping ground of Swedish and Habsburg armies. In 1640, in the 22 years since the beginning of the war, the population of Berlin had fallen from about 14,000 to about 6,000. Hundreds of villages had been completely wiped out. The great elector Frederick William concluded that in his position, ruling a small and open territory, without natural frontiers or the strategic possibility of defense in depth, he must put his main reliance on a competent army. With an effective army, even if small, he could force the stronger states to take him into their calculations and thereby enter with some hope of advantage into the politics of the balance of power. This long remained the program of the Brandenburgers, to have an army but not to use it, to conserve it with loving and even miserly care, to keep an army in being, and to gain their ends by diplomatic maneuver. They did so by siding with France against the Habsburgs or with Sweden against Poland. They aspired also to the title not merely of Margrave or Elector, but to the rank of king. The opportunity came in 1701, when the Habsburg Emperor was preparing to enter the War of the Spanish Succession. The Emperor requested the Elector of Brandenburg, who was then Frederick III, to support him with 8,000 troops. The Elector named his price: recognition of himself by the Emperor as king in Prussia. The Emperor yielded. The title, at first explicitly limited to the less honorable king in Prussia, soon became King of Prussia. The Elector Frederick III of Brandenburg became 418 King Frederick I of Prussia. Another thread was torn from the fraying fabric of the Holy Roman Empire, and there was now a German king above all the other German princes. 219. The Growth of Prussia, 1415-1918. The maps shown here, going well beyond the scope of this chapter, give an overview of Prussian history from the time when Brandenburg began to expand in the 17th century. One may see, by looking at all the panels together, how Prussia was really an East European state until 1815. Its center of gravity shifted westward in significant degree only in the 19th century. Panel 2 shows the early formation of 3 unconnected territories. Panel 3, the huge bulk of Silesia relative to the small kingdom that annexed it. Panel 4, the fruits of the partitions of Poland. 419, Panel 5, Napoleon pared Prussia down. The main crisis at the Congress of Vienna and its resolution are shown in panels 6 and 7. Bismarck's enlargement of Prussia appears in Panel 8. The boundaries established by Bismarck remained unchanged until the fall of the monarchy in 1918. The Prussian military state. The preoccupation of Prussia with its army was unquestionably defensive in origin, arising from the horrors of the 30 Years' War. But the military emphasis outlasted its cause and shaped the evolving character of the country. Prussia was not unique in the attention it paid to its armed forces. The unique thing about Prussia was the disproportion between the size of the army and the size of the resources on which the army was based. The government, to maintain the army, had to direct and plan the life of the country for this purpose. Nor was Prussia the originator of the standing army, kept 220 active in time of peace and always preparing for war. Most governments adopted the methods of Louis XIV in establishing standing armies, not merely to promote foreign ambitions, but to keep armed forces out of the hands of nobles or military adventurers and under control by the state. But Prussia was unique in that, more than in any other country, the army developed a life of its own, almost independent of the life of the state. It was older than the Prussian state itself. In 1657, the Great Elector fought a great battle at Warsaw with soldiers from all parts of his dominions. It was the first time that people from Cleves, Brandenburg, and Ducal Prussia had ever done anything together. The army was the first all-Prussian institution. Institutions of civilian government developed later and largely to meet the needs of the army. And in later generations, the army proved more durable than the state. When Prussia collapsed during the Napoleonic Wars in 1806, the spirit and morale of the Prussian army carried on. And when the Hohenzollern Empire finally crashed in 1918, the Prussian-shaped army still maintained its life and traditions within the Weimar Republic. Which again, it survived. Not until the defeat 420 of Adolf Hitler in the Second World War and the establishment of a new Republican regime was the army and its military traditions totally subordinated to civilian authority, the Prussian Army 221. In all countries, to some extent, the machinery of the modern state developed as a means of supporting armed forces, but in Prussia, the process was exceptionally clear and simple. In Prussia, the rulers drew roughly half their income from the crown domain and only about half from taxes. The crown domain, consisting of manors and other productive enterprises owned directly by the ruler as a traditional lord, was in effect a kind of government property, for the Prussian rulers used their income almost entirely for state purposes, being personally simple and even Spartan in their habits. The rulers of Prussia, until a century after the accession of the Great Elector, were able to pay the whole cost of their civil government from their own income, the proceeds of the crown domain. To develop the domain and transfer the funds into government expenditures, they created a large body of civilian officials. The domain bulked so large that much of the economy of the country was not in private hands, but consisted of enterprises owned and administered by the state. For additional income, the Great Elector introduced taxes of the kind used in France, such as excise taxes on consumers, goods, and a government monopoly on the sale of salt. All taxes, for a century after the accession of the Great Elector, were levied specifically for the use of the army. Financing the army. Economic life grew up under government sponsorship, rather than through the enterprise of a venturesome business class. This was because, for a rural country to maintain an organized army, productive and 421 technical skills had to be imported, mainly from the West. The Great Elector in his youth spent a number of years in Holland, where he was impressed by the wealth and prosperity that he saw. After becoming Elector, he settled Swiss and Frisians in Brandenburg. The Frisians were akin to the Dutch. He welcomed Jews from Poland. And when Louis XIV began to persecute the French Protestants, he provided funds and special officials to assist the immigration of 20,000 Huguenots to Brandenburg. French immigrants, for a time, formed a sixth of the population of Berlin and were the most advanced commercial element of that comparatively undeveloped city. The government, as in France under Colbert, initiated and helped to finance various industries. But the importance of such government participation was greater than in France, because the amount of privately owned capital available for investment was incomparably less. Military needs, more than elsewhere, dominated the market for goods, because civilian demand in so poor a country was relatively low. The army, in its requirements for food, uniforms, and weapons, became a strong force in shaping the early modern economic growth of the country. The army had a profound effect also on the social development and class structure of Prussia. The civilian middle class was generally willing to accept the military priorities, and it became the policy of the rulers to absorb practically the whole landed aristocracy, the Junkers, into military service. They used the army, with conscious purpose, as a means of implementing an all-Prussian psychology in the landed families of Cleves, Brandenburg, Pomerania, and the former dominions of the Teutonic Knights. The fact that Prussia was a very recent and artificial combination of territories, so that identification with it was not a traditional sentiment, made it all the more necessary to instill loyalty by martial means. Emphasis fell on duty, obedience, service, and sacrifice. That military virtues became characteristic of the whole male Prussian aristocracy was also due, like so much else, to the small size of the population. In France, for example, with perhaps 50,000 male adult nobles, only a small minority served as army officers. In Prussia, there were few Junker families that did not have some of their members in uniform. 422, the Army and Prussian Society. The Great Elector and his successors, like all absolutist rulers of the era, repressed the estates or parliamentary assemblages in which the landed aristocracy was the main 222 element. To mollify the squires, the rulers promised commissions in the army to men of their class. They promised them also a free hand over their peasants. The Prussian monarchy was largely based on an understanding between the ruler and the landlord gentry. The latter agreed to accept the ruler's government and to serve in his army, in return for holding their own peasants in hereditary subjection. Serfdom spread in Prussia as elsewhere in Eastern Europe. In East Prussia, the peasants fell into conditions that were as deplorable as the agricultural conditions in Poland. The Prussian rulers believed that the Junkers made better army officers because they were accustomed to the habit of commanding their own peasants. To preserve the officer class, legislation forbade the sale of noble lands, that is, manors, to persons not noble. In France, again by way of contrast, where manorial rights had become simply a form of property, bourgeois persons and even peasants could legally acquire manors and enjoy a lordly or seigneurial income. In Prussia, this was not possible. Classes were frozen by owning non-exchangeable forms of property. It was thus harder for middle-class people to enter the aristocracy by setting up as landed gentry. The bourgeois class, in any case, had little spirit of independence. Few of the old towns of Germany were in Prussia. The Prussian middle class was not wealthy, and it had not gained much influence through the possession of private property. The typical middle-class man was an official who worked for the government as an employee of the large crown domain, or in an enterprise subsidized by the state. The civil service in Prussia, from the days of the Great Elector, became notable for its honesty and efficiency. But the middle class, more than elsewhere, deferred to the nobles, served the state, and accepted the pervasive public role of the army. 423. Limited social mobility. These distinctive features of Prussian social life and military service developed especially under Frederick William I, who was king from 1713 to 1740. He was an earthy, uncouth man who disdained whatever savored of culture, to which his father, his grandfather, the Great Elector, and also his son, Frederick the Great, were all strongly attracted. He begrudged every penny not spent on the army. He cut the expense of the royal household by 3/4. On his coronation journey to Königsberg, he spent 2,547 thalers, where his father had spent 5 million. He ruled the country in a fatherly hierarchical style, supervising it like a private estate, prowling the streets of Berlin in an old, seedy uniform and disciplining negligent citizens with blows of his walking stick. He worked all the time and expected everyone else to do likewise. Frederick William I. He loved the army, which all his policies were designed to serve. He was the first Prussian king to appear always in uniform. He rearranged the order of courtly precedence, moving army officers up and civilians down. His love of tall soldiers is famous. He collected a special unit, men between 6 and 7 feet tall, from all over Europe, and indeed the Russian Tsar Peter the Great sent him some from Asia. He devised new forms of discipline and maneuver, founded a cadet corps to train the sons of the Junkers, and invented a new system of recruiting. The canton system, long the most effective in Europe, by which each regiment had a particular district or canton assigned to it as a source of soldiers. He raised the size of the army from 40,000 at his accession to 83,000 at his death. During his reign, Berlin grew to be a city of 100,000, of whom 20,000 were soldiers, a proportion probably unmatched in any other city of Europe. He likewise left to his successor, for he fought practically no wars, himself a war chest of 7,000 thalers. 424. With this army and war chest, Frederick II, later called the Great, who became king in 1740, startled Europe. Charles VI of Austria had just died. His daughter Maria Theresa entered upon her manifold inheritance, which depended on the long-negotiated guarantees to 223 of the Pragmatic Sanction. While others waited, Frederick struck. Serving no notice, he quickly moved his military forces into Silesia, which was a part of the Kingdom of Bohemia on the side toward Poland, lying in the upper valley of the Oder River and adjoining Brandenburg on the north. The addition of Silesia to the Kingdom of Prussia almost doubled the population and added valuable industries, so that Prussia now, with 6 million people and an army that Frederick raised to 200,000, at last established itself as a great power. It must be added that, judged simply as a human accomplishment, Prussia was a remarkable political and military creation, a state made on a shoestring, a triumph of work and duty. The advances of Frederick the Great